In a quiet suburb where rules reign supreme, one man's arrival sparked a battle of wills that would expose the tyrant behind the gates, proving that patience can topple even the most entitled empire. The first time Karen screamed at me, it wasn't because I'd broken a rule. It was because I'd obeyed one she didn't know existed. She had slammed the HOA gate shut so hard the metal shook, blocking my truck from entering the community I just legally moved into. And with a voice trembling more from entitlement than fear, she shrieked, "You do not have access to this property." That's when the sheriff's cruiser rolled up behind me, lights off, calm as a breeze, and he stepped out, holding a worn-out key. Without a word, he unlocked the very gate she'd sealed shut and waved me through like a VIP. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a broken garage door, and for a few seconds, the only thing louder than her silence was the squeak of the swinging gate she no longer controlled. I drove through slowly, windows down, as if gliding past a statue of defeat, knowing full well that what I'd just done wasn't illegal, wasn't disrespectful. It was simply unexpected. And in a neighborhood like this, unexpected meant war. It had all started a few days earlier when I signed the final paperwork on a foreclosure lot inside a well-known suburban community just outside of town. It was the kind of place where the lawns looked cloned, the dogs wore sweaters, and the mailboxes had hoist stickers like badges of honor. I'd inherited the property from a cousin I barely knew, but the paperwork was rock solid. As a landowner within the boundaries, I had every legal right to access the community and attend any HOA business, including the meeting that was taking place that very day. What I didn't know, what no one warned me about, was that this HOA had a queen and her name was Karen. She was the self-appointed gatekeeper of everything from paint color to barbecue smoke. Her name wasn't on every rule, but her signature hovered over every complaint. Her handwriting curled around every passive-aggressive flyer taped to residents' doors. The HOA office, which looked like a converted preschool, was where Karen reigned from a desk surrounded by binders, file cabinets, and a suspiciously large jar of peanut M&Ms labeled board use only. I walked in with my deed, my ID, and a half smile, fully expecting a boring verification process. Instead, Karen rose like a storm cloud in a pantsuit and immediately blocked my way with her arms stretched stiff as a gate bar. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked with the smugness of a TSA agent at peak power. "You can't be here unannounced." I calmly explained who I was, showed her the deed, even offered to wait my turn. But that wasn't the point. The point was I was new. I hadn't kissed the ring. I hadn't received her approval. And in her mind, that meant I was trespassing. She pulled out her phone and with a theatrical flair told the person on the other end there was a suspicious man trying to infiltrate the office. That's when I laughed, a short confused chuckle, thinking she must be joking. She wasn't. 10 minutes later, the sheriff arrived and before she could launch into a dramatic retelling, he looked at me, recognized my last name, nodded, and asked, "You got the deed with you?" I handed it over. He scanned it, squinted, then looked back at Karen. "He owns the place. You'll need to unlock the gate." She froze. I thought maybe her battery died mid-melt, but no, it was worse. She hadn't accounted for anyone questioning her authority in public. She fumbled with keys, stammered something about protocol, and tried to pretend she was just doing her job. But the damage was done. People were watching from their porches, recording on their phones. I drove through that gate slowly, deliberately, the way you sip tea in front of someone who told you there's none left. That night, the retaliation began. My trash can was mysteriously moved to the far side of the road. A neighbor's dog, who previously wagged its tail at me, now barked from a distance. And the next morning, I found a fine taped to my door for unauthorized landscaping, which apparently included the existence of a garden hose. I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a campaign. Karen had declared me an intruder, and she would use every policy, technicality, and half-written bylaw in her arsenal to drive me out. But what she didn't know, what no one in the neighborhood could possibly guess, was that I didn't just come here to live quietly. I came here with time, resources, and a memory sharp as razors. I had no plans to retaliate through shouting matches or angry note. No, I played the long game. I read the HOA bylaws like a thriller novel, highlighting every loophole, marking every contradiction. I found 3 sections where Karen had exceeded her authority and another 2 where the board had violated voting procedures. I wasn't just going to survive here. I was going to reshape the battlefield. But before I could launch my quiet counterattack, Karen made her next move. She tried to ban me from the next HOA meeting on grounds of disruptive behavior. The email she sent out described me as aggressive, non-compliant, and unverified. A cocktail of adjectives that only made sense if you ignored everything that had actually happened. I replied with a copy of the deed and a request for all meeting minutes under public transparency guidelines. The board was forced to let me attend. Still, when I showed up, Karen tried to block me at the door again, this time holding a flimsy rope barrier like it was the drawbridge to a castle. That's when I pulled out my phone and pressed play on a voice recording I'd made of our earlier interaction, complete with her calling me suspicious and the sheriff telling her to let me in. The sound of her own voice echoing through the hall made the other board members shift uncomfortably. Karen looked like someone had poured vinegar into her coffee. She stepped aside without a word, and I took my seat at the back, smiling. I didn't speak during that meeting. I didn't need to. I simply watched, listened, and took note because Karen had declared war on the wrong person. And while she was busy counting violations and filing complaints, I was counting steps, every strategic move she made, every witness to her behavior, every inch of property line. She thought this was a game of power. I knew it was a game of patience. And that's when I decided the next time she locked a gate, she'd be the one outside. The next time she tried to block my access, she'd find her own authority boxed in. And the next time she screamed, it wouldn't be at me. It would be at the fence wrapped perfectly around her car, sitting neatly on land she didn't know I owned. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the smell of passive-aggressive warfare had already settled thick in the air like overwatered mulch. I opened my front door expecting peace and coffee and was instead greeted by a neatly printed violation notice taped dead center on the glass accusing me of unauthorized ornamentation, specifically a windshield made from recycled copper spoons hanging on my porch. That windshield, which I'd built with my late uncle during one of our rare sober weekends, had apparently triggered some kind of suburban emergency. I stood there, still barefoot, holding the notice in one hand and my coffee in the other, letting the absurdity settle into my bones. Karen had wasted no time. Not only had she twisted the HOA rules into a medieval weapon overnight, she'd even attached a blurry Polaroid of the alleged violation taken from what looked like the bushes across the street, complete with the reflection of someone's reading glasses in the corner of the frame. The fine was $45 and had to be paid by Thursday or else. No clarification on what or else meant, but knowing Karen, it involved humiliation or a lawn sign declaring me non-compliant. I didn't tear the notice up. I didn't storm over to her front porch. I took it inside, scanned it, printed 3 copies, and began building a paper trail. The first rule of fighting someone like Karen is never give them what they want. They want noise. They want outrage. I gave her silence process and a strategy. Over the next few days, the petty violations escalated with the precision of a military campaign. One day it was improper hose storage. The next it was my lawn being 1.6 in over the approved maximum grass height. Then came the accusation that my mailbox was not in alignment with the community aesthetic, which was odd because it was the same mailbox that had been there for years before I moved in, right down to the chipped paint and rusted flag. It was like being swatted to death by glitter-coated toothpick. What she didn't realize was that I kept a log, took photos of my compliance, and even started filming her nightly strolls past my property with her flashlight and her ever-present clipboard. She didn't know I'd installed 2 wildlife cameras hidden in decorative owls on my front lawn, each one trained on the sidewalk and mailbox area. On one of the recordings, she's seen bending down, straightening the edge of my welcome mat with gloved hands, and whispering to herself, "Still looks smug." That alone could have won me the case in front of any sane HOA arbitration panel. But I wasn't after victory. I was after clarity. I wanted to know what drove her obsession with control. What made her feel that I, a legal homeowner with nothing but good intentions and recycled wind chimes, posed a threat to the HOA ecosystem? She believed she ruled over like a discount empress. I didn't have to wait long. While combing through the property records for my deed, I came across something unexpected. A discrepancy in the boundary lines between my lot and Karen's. It wasn't huge, just a sliver of land about 4 feet wide and 20 feet long. But it mattered. It mattered because Karen's fancy backyard deck, complete with a hot tub and matching flamingo statue, extended precisely 4 feet into my property. The irony was so delicious I could have bottled it and sold it at the farmer's market. I printed the survey map, marked the encroachment in red, and placed it in a folder labeled "For Later." The game was shifting, and Karen didn't even know she was playing it with a broken rook. But before I could act on the boundary line revelation, she made another move. This time, it came in the form of a community newsletter, a glossy little 4-page production she emailed to every resident and also hand-delivered to a few select homes. In it, she described a growing concern about new residents failing to uphold the aesthetic integrity of our community. No names were mentioned, but she included a photo of my house taken at dawn with my truck parked in the driveway, captioned, "A troubling trend." I didn't get mad. I got popcorn. Because what Karen didn't realize is that by publishing that photo, she had just violated multiple privacy and defamation guidelines under the HOA's own communications policy. It was tucked away in Section 8.3, a dusty clause no one had probably read in 10 years, but it was there, and I printed it, highlighted, annotated. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Wednesday evening in the Common House, a modest brick building that smelled like lemon-scented mop water, and panicked. I arrived early, took a seat in the back, and watched as neighbors trickled in. Some gave me sheepish nods, others avoided eye contact. Karen entered last, clipboard under one arm, newsletter in hand, lips pursed like she was preparing for a dental exam. When it came time for open comments, I stood, cleared my throat, and said, "I have a question about the privacy standards outlined in Section 8.3 of our HOA communications policy." Karen flinched. I continued, calmly referencing the clause, citing the newsletter, and asking whether the board had approved its content prior to distribution. The room went quiet except for the sound of someone dropping their pen. Karen tried to speak, but her words stumbled over themselves. She said it was an internal draft not meant for circulation, which only made things worse since that implied she had printed and distributed something unofficial. One of the other board members asked if the photo had been taken without consent. Karen's face turned the color of expired yogurt. After the meeting, I noticed several neighbors hanging around, talking in hushed voices. A woman named Mara who lived 3 houses down and always wore gardening gloves like they were part of her skin came up to me and said, "We've been waiting for someone like you. She's been running this place like a petty kingdom for years." That night, I received 5 anonymous letters in my mailbox thanking me for speaking up. One came with a coupon for a local pizza joint and a handwritten note that said, "You're doing the Lord's work. Pepperoni on us." Something was shifting. I kept the letters, not for ego, but for evidence. Something was shifting in the neighborhood. People were paying attention. Karen, for all her bluster and obsession with rules, had drawn too much attention to herself. She wasn't the silent enforcer anymore. She was the loud problem, and she was about to find out what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the very scrutiny she had weaponized. Because the next move wouldn't be just about me. It would involve bylaws, voting procedures, and a surprise nomination. I was going to step inside the gates of her castle, pull up a chair to the throne, and start reading the rulebook she'd misused for years. And I would do it without raising my voice or breaking a single policy. Because while she played checkers in the open, I was playing chess in the 2 days after the meeting shadows, and my queen was already in position. 2 days after the meeting, I walked past Karen's house and saw her watering her flower bed with the same intensity most people reserved for a courtroom cross-examination. Her eyes scanning my every move while her hydrangeas soaked in what I could only assume was the liquid form of suppressed fury. I didn't wave, didn't smirk, just kept walking with a copy of the HOA charter tucked under my arm and an unopened envelope in my back pocket. That envelope contained my application to run for a seat on the HOA board. I knew exactly what I was doing. I wasn't applying because I wanted to be part of Karen's club or because I had an affinity for enforcing mailbox height. I was applying because I wanted to bring transparency to a place where power had gone unchallenged for far too long. Karen thought she was untouchable, a monarch in cul-de-sac territory. But what she didn't realize was that democracy had moved in 3 weeks ago and brought snacks. The announcement of the upcoming board election was posted in the community bulletin and emailed to residents with a sentence that seemed written through gritted teeth. New applicants welcome to run. I submitted mine at exactly 9 a.m. sharp, knowing she'd be at the office pretending to sort paperwork and hoping no one would challenge her authority. Her reaction was everything I'd imagined. When I handed her the sealed form, she opened it without even waiting for permission, eyes scanning the paper like it was a threat assessment. Her voice cracked only slightly when she said, "You do know this isn't a ceremonial position, the door closed behind me, right?" I smiled and said, "I'm counting on that." I walked away before she could respond, already picturing the emergency phone call she'd start making the second the door closed behind me. That afternoon, flyers began appearing around the neighborhood, not from me, but from Karen. They were worded diplomatically, but the message was unmistakable. We need experienced leadership in uncertain we need experienced leadership times. Beware of candidates with unclear intentions. Uphold tradition and vote for stability. She never mentioned me by name, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew who the new guy was. The problem for Karen was that people were already talking and not in whispers anymore. The neighbors who'd once been too afraid to say anything were now curious, even hopeful. They had started stopping me during my walks, asking questions, offering encouragement. One even offered to host a meet and greet in their garage with folding chairs and lemonade. It was surreal. What started as a campaign of retaliation had turned into a grassroots uprising against ornamental tyranny. I didn't need signs or slogans. I needed the truth. And the truth was Karen had been running the HOA like her own petty kingdom for years, reimbursing herself for expenses no one could trace, rejecting reasonable improvement requests with no oversight, and bending the rules whenever it suited her mood. So, at the garage meet and greet, I brought the receipts, literally copies of board meeting minutes where she authorized snack reimbursements totaling thousands of dollars. Purchase orders for printer ink and office chairs that had no corresponding items anywhere in the office. A list of denied yard improvement applications that all had one thing in common. They came from people who'd previously questioned her. The neighbors listened in stunned silence, mouths full of lemonade and shock. One woman actually gasped when I read out loud the year Karen approved a motion to purchase seasonal decor storage solutions that turned out to be a set of plastic tubs and a new bookshelf for her home office. Someone from the back muttered, "She's been decorating on our dime." The next day, I received a warning notice taped to my door accusing me of holding an unauthorized political rally on private property. The paper was torn, the tape uneven, and it smelled faintly of expired toner. Karen was spiraling. She wasn't just upset, she was threatened. And when people like Karen feel threatened, they double down. She called an emergency HOA board session to discuss election conduct violations, clearly hoping to get me disqualified. But during that meeting, which I attended as a silent observer seated in the far corner of the room, one of the longtime board members asked a simple question. "Can you point to the section in the bylaws that prohibits resident gatherings for information exchange?" Karen fumbled. She pulled out her binder, flipped through it, muttered about intent and tone, but couldn't find the clause. Another member chimed in, "I thought we were supposed to encourage community participation." Karen said something about maintaining order. Someone else said, "Maybe the real issue is that people feel left out of decisions." The air in the room changed. For the first time, I saw cracks forming in the wall she'd spent years building. After the meeting, two of the board members approached me privately. They told me they hadn't realized how much she'd been operating without proper transparency. They didn't exactly endorse me, but they didn't need to. Their shift in posture was endorsement enough. That weekend, I held a second gathering, this time on the grassy patch beside the tennis courts, a space technically designated for recreational use and therefore not subject to any permit restrictions. More neighbors came bringing folding chairs, lemonade, even cookies. A retired teacher brought copies of past newsletters and marked them with discrepancies in reported expenses. An ex-city clerk showed up with advice on how to petition for a bylaw revision. It wasn't just a campaign anymore. It was a community recalibrating itself. And Karen. She was watching it all unfold from behind her darkened windows, probably clutching her clipboard like a security blanket. She hadn't counted on resistance that didn't yell or threaten or vandalize. She hadn't prepared for civility with evidence and law on its side, so she resorted to what she knew best: control. The following Monday, she had the locks changed on the HOA office and claimed it was due to a security concern stemming from a possible break-in. The board hadn't approved it. There was no report filed with local law enforcement, just a unilateral action with a suspiciously convenient excuse. I contacted the election day arrived sheriff again. This time I had photos of the new locks, a copy of the HOA's rules about access procedures, and a printed email where Karen stated no vote was held. The sheriff shook his head slowly and said she's going to dig herself into a hole if she keeps this up. I asked him if he'd be willing to come with me to the office later that day just to make sure everything was done peacefully. He agreed. And so once again I arrived at the gate. This time with a small but growing election day arrived wrapped in sunshine and silent tension, the kind that buzzed in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm. Lawn sprinklers clicked in unison across the neighborhood as if rehearsed. Children played with half-hearted energy on driveways. And Karen, wearing a salmon-pink blazer with shoulder pads so stiff they could deflect arrows, patrolled the sidewalks like a mall cop on a caffeine high. She wasn't smiling. Her mouth was doing that thing where it pressed into a single straight line as if she were physically holding in a monologue of complaints. She stood outside the HOA office like a gargoyle, greeting some neighbors with plastic sweetness and others with suspicious squint. Meanwhile, I did what I always did. I stayed calm, walked slowly, nodded politely, and let the weight of my silence speak louder than any signboard or slogan. I had no posters, no slogans, no pins. I only had 3 months of clean, methodical actions and an inbox full of neighbors quietly cheering me on. The voting took place in the HOA Community Hall, a rectangular space with beige walls, plastic folding tables, and a faint smell of lemons, floor wax and old conflict. Each resident checked in, voted on slips, and placed them in a locked plastic box guarded by 2 volunteers who were too old to care about the drama and too wise to be manipulated. I voted last. Karen watched me as I folded my slip. She tried to smile, but it came out crooked, her eyes twitching like she just swallowed something sour. I dropped the ballot, nodded to the volunteers, and walked out. It was done. But Karen wasn't finished. She never was. That afternoon, I received another fine. This one for unauthorized use of lawn space, referencing a folding chair I'd set out for my elderly neighbor who liked to sit and watch the sunset. The photo attached showed the chair empty with the word nuisance circled in red ink below it. I didn't bother responding. I just filed the election results, logged the date and time, and waited. The election results were scheduled for the next morning, but by midnight, rumors were already swirling. A neighbor texted me a screenshot of a community Facebook group post where someone anonymously accused me of running a smear campaign with out-of-context documents. Another neighbor told me Karen had been knocking on doors, quietly suggesting the vote was invalid due to foreign influence, by which she apparently meant my cousin, who had legally transferred the property to me. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so desperate. And yet, I didn't sleep, not because I was nervous, but because I was ready. I knew Karen wouldn't go down quietly. So, I spent the early hours reviewing every HOA regulation again, drinking black coffee, and organizing every document I had into one giant folder labeled just in case. The next morning, the announcement was a slow, excruciating unraveling made. I'd won the seat on the HOA board with a clear majority. Karen retained hers only because her term hadn't expired yet. But the vote revealed something she couldn't unsee. She'd lost control. What followed was a slow, excruciating unraveling. In the days after the election, she started issuing new fines with cartoonish urgency. One for a garden gnome that looked judgmental, another for a welcome mat that had faded slightly, and yet another for a barbecue grill that she claimed released aggressive smells. But the community wasn't buying it anymore. Neighbors began challenging her, requesting appeal hearings, demanding written explanations. Her beloved clipboard no longer scared anyone. It looked like a relic from a forgotten era. Then came the gate stunt. One morning, I woke up to find the main entrance gate code no longer worked. A line of cars stretched down the road. Residents stuck outside while Karen stood on the inside sidewalk, arms crossed, offering to buzz people in manually. She claimed it was a necessary update for community safety, but conveniently forgot to notify anyone, including the board. I called the sheriff again. By now, he knew the story like a sitcom plot. He showed up, checked the gate system, and confirmed the code change was unauthorized. Standing beside him in front of a growing group of irritated neighbors, I watched Karen insist she'd emailed everyone the new code, only to be met with a flurry of confused voices, saying no such email was ever received. The sheriff unlocked the gate himself using the master key, waved everyone in, and gave Karen a tight-lipped lecture about protocol and obstruction. She stared at the ground as the community flowed past her like a river moving around a rock that no longer mattered. I should have left it there, but she didn't. The following night, I heard rustling outside around 2 a.m. and, already half suspecting something, pulled up the feed from my wildlife cams. There, in grainy black and white, was a figure in a hoodie dragging what looked like bags of trash toward my lawn. I zoomed in and paused. It was Karen's adult son who still lived with her and had a reputation for collecting garage sale items he never used. He looked like a raccoon caught middies. The next morning, I printed the photos and delivered them to the sheriff with a brief statement. He sighed, rubbed his forehead, and said he'd handle it. Within hours, Karen received an official harassment warning, and neighbors began whispering again, this time with bolder volume. At the next HOA meeting, I proposed a motion requiring prior board approval before any gate access changes could be made. Karen objected, but the vote passed easily. Then I proposed another motion requiring receipts for all reimbursements to be published in a monthly transparency report. Karen didn't even speak. She just stared at her clipboard like it had betrayed her. Then came the final spark. Using my earlier survey data, I filed a request to build a privacy fence along the precise edge of my property. It was within my rights. The board approved it without hesitation. And so I hired a crew, marked the boundary with red flags, and began construction. The fence curved naturally following the property line, and as it neared the eastern edge, it wrapped perfectly legally around a small slice of land where Karen's car, for years, had routinely been parked. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because it was mine. The day the final panel went up, Karen came outside, saw the fence blocking her car in, and for a moment looked like she'd forgotten how to breathe. She marched over, demanded I take it down, said I was trapping her property. I handed her the survey map and said, "The land's mine, and you parked on it. I didn't touch your car. I just fenced my line." Her eyes darted like she was looking for a trap door to escape through, but there wasn't one. Not this time. She tried to climb the fence, slipped and landed with a splash in her neighbor's kiddie pool, sending plastic flamingos and foam noodles flying into the air like a tragic panada explosion. The entire street had gathered by then, phones raised, some trying not to laugh, others openly howling. That video, it went viral before sundown. And Karen, for once, had no fine to issue, no rule to cite, no clipboard to hide behind. Her kingdom had crumbled one policy at a time, until all that remained was a soggy pink blazer and a silence she couldn't weaponize. The aftermath of the fence incident rippled through the neighborhood like a shockwave wrapped in gossip and dipped in popcorn butter, with everyone adding their own spices to the tale of Karen flailing into a kiddie pool surrounded by flamingo corpses. The video had made its way from neighborly group chats to a local Facebook page called Suburbia Sagas, then to TikTok where it was captioned "Queen Karen dethroned by gravity and HOA karma." Her collapse wasn't just physical anymore. It was political, reputational, spiritual. And though I'd done nothing but build a legally approved fence on my own property, somehow I had become both folk hero and villain, depending on who you asked. But while Karen limped around pretending she hadn't bruised both her spine and her soul, her fury was quietly regrouping. I didn't underestimate her silence. I'd learned that when she wasn't screaming, she was scheming. And I was right. A week later, I received a certified letter from the county accusing me of housing unpermitted livestock in a residential zone. Livestock. I read it 3 times just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. According to the complaint, I had constructed a non-compliant structure on the rear half of my property with the explicit purpose of sheltering poultry, goats, and possibly ferrets. The accusation was so oddly specific, I nearly applauded. She hadn't just filed a bogus complaint. She'd painted it with enough weird detail to make it seem plausible. That was her gift. Make absurdity sound reasonable enough and let the system do the rest. But this time, she'd miscalculated because the so-called livestock structure was a small Zen hut I'd built myself for meditation and bonsai care. It didn't have plumbing or electricity. It didn't exceed height limits, and it certainly wasn't sheltering goat. I invited the county officer over myself, offered him coffee, and showed him the hut. We sat in silence for a moment inside it, listening to wind chimes and soft instrumental flute music I'd queued up from a speaker in my house. He shook his head, sighed, and said, "This is the most peaceful violation I've ever investigated." He left 10 minutes later with a copy of the zoning guidelines and a renewed appreciation for Japanese architecture. But the fallout didn't end there. That same day, I discovered Karen had installed a fake no parking sign in front of her house. One that looked exactly like the official HOA markers, but wasn't registered anywhere. It even had a fake cement base, which she'd painted to match the existing sidewalk slab. The deception was beautiful in its pettiness. The sign declared reserved for HOA use only and had apparently discouraged several visiting families from parking nearby during a community event. I brought the issue up at the next board meeting, and when asked directly, Karen claimed it had been there for years. I presented time-stamped photos from 6 months ago showing nothing but clean curb. Then I showed a photo of the base's wet cement trail leading to her garage from 3 days earlier. She said nothing. The board voted to have all signage verified and removed if unapproved. The next morning, the fake sign was gone, and Karen stood on her lawn like a statue of injustice with a leaf blower aimed at no leaves in particular. People had started to speak of her in past tense, like a faded tradition they weren't sure they missed. And still, she clung to power like a cat to a curtain it had already shredded. But while she was busy digging through old policies trying to weaponize technicalities, I was planning something bigger. I wasn't just going to defend myself anymore. I was going to change how the HOA worked. I drafted a proposal for a new amendment requiring all board reimbursement expenses to be pre-approved and publicly posted on the HOA portal. It was simple, transparent, and impossible to oppose without looking suspicious. Karen tried. She said it would create unnecessary bureaucracy and open the board to potential harassment from nosy neighbors. Her voice cracked as she said the words, and the boardroom was still. I countered with a summary of past expenses. Thousands spent over the last 5 years on ambiguous items listed as administrative sustenance and decorative efficiency. The amendment passed 5-1. She was the one. Her hands trembled as she took notes, her usual smug scribbles replaced with erratic underlines and tense doodles in the margin. After the meeting, she didn't storm out. She lingered, hunched over her chair like a villain at the end of a poorly received sequel, quietly packing up her things. I thought it might finally be over, but Karen, like mildew and glitter, always found a way to return. A few days later, a neighbor knocked on my door, holding a letter he'd found folded under his welcome mat. It was a typed note suggesting that I had a hidden criminal record and asking whether it was safe to have someone like me on the board. The letter wasn't signed, but laced with phrases Karen had used in prior emails. Integrity of the community, potential liability, unknown history. I wasn't surprised, but I was tired. So, I made my next move public. I called for a special HOA meeting, which any board member could do, and asked for it to be held in the open with all residents invited. The agenda: clarification on board conduct, review of recent complaints, and a discussion on community leadership standard. When the meeting began, the room was fuller than I'd ever seen it. People brought folding chairs, some brought snack. A group of teens set up a live stream in the corner. Karen walked in last, arms crossed, eyes scanning for weaknesses. I started calmly recapping the events since my arrival. The gate incident, the bogus fines, the unauthorized lock change, the fence, the livestock lie, the sign scam. I presented documents, photos, and statements. One by one, neighbors stood up to speak. A woman talked about having her yard improvement application denied 3 years in a row until she gave up. A retired vet described how Karen once reported him for having an unkempt flag because the wind flipped it sideways. A teenager read a list of every rule Karen had invented verbally but never actually recorded. It became clear that I wasn't the issue. I was the catalyst. The HOA president, who had remained silent for much of the past chaos, finally stood and said, "Perhaps it's time we ask if certain individuals are serving this community or serving themselves." There was a pause, a murmur, and then a slow ripple of agreement. Karen didn't respond. She sat with her clipboard clutched in both hands, her fingers tapping rapidly against the plastic as if waiting for a reset button to appear. But there wasn't one. A motion was made to vote on restructuring board roles and removing any members found to have abused their position. It passed. Karen's face collapsed into itself. Not a dramatic scream or a flailing tantrum. Just a quiet implosion, the air finally leaving a balloon that had inflated too far for too long. She stood up, said nothing, and walked out. And though she technically hadn't resigned yet, everyone in that room knew she was finished. The fence had been the symbol. The meetings had been the trial. This was the verdict. The neighborhood wasn't under siege anymore. It was healing. And I hadn't won because I fought louder. I'd won because I fought smarter. And because when the sheriff unlocked that gate for me all those weeks ago, he wasn't just opening a lock. He was opening the beginning of Karen's end. The days that followed Karen's quiet walkout were unusually peaceful, as if the neighborhood itself had exhaled for the first time in years. Porch lights seemed a little warmer. Kids played without being told to keep their laughter below 65 dBs. And for the first time, people actually waved at each other without suspicion. But I wasn't naive enough to think that a woman like Karen just disappeared. She wasn't wired to surrender, only to retreat and reframe. So, I kept my eyes open, my cameras rolling, and my paperwork current. The HOA meetings went on without her, smoother than ever. We passed new amendments that allowed digital petitioning, community budget transparency, and even a trial for open floor voting. Residents came not just to complain, but to participate. Mara, the gardening gloves lady, started a neighborhood composting project. Pete, the retired electrician, offered to inspect old power boxes for free. People were no longer afraid to do good things because of the threat of some cryptic citation wrapped in red ink and passive-aggressive language. And yet, as calm settled in, small tremors of Karen's presence began to resurface. It started with a newsletter, and signed, dropped into mailboxes in the dead of night, printed on the same thick ivory cardstock she always insisted made communications feel official. The title read, "What They're Not Telling You," and it was filled with vague accusations about the new board's misuse of power, threats to property value, and alleged favoritism in enforcement. The grammar was rigid, the tone unmistakably hers, and the scent of resentment clung to every sentence like a cheap perfume. Most people laughed it off, but I didn't. I knew Karen didn't deal in warnings. She dealt in traps. So, I started looking for the next shoe to drop, and I didn't have to wait long. One afternoon, the county assessor's office contacted me about a zoning complaint that had been escalated by an anonymous concerned neighbor. This time the accusation was that my fence obstructed emergency vehicle access and posed a fire hazard. I almost laughed until I realized the complaint had already triggered a mandatory inspection and a temporary freeze on any further property modifications. Karen had gone outside the HOA, now weaponizing public channels to get what she could no longer control internally. The fire marshal came out with a measuring tape, a clipboard, and a surprisingly good sense of humor. We walked the fence line together, confirmed all clearance requirements were met, and even calculated that an entire fire truck could do donuts in my driveway if it wanted to. He filed the report, cleared me completely, and shook his head as he got back in his truck. "You've got yourself a creative enemy," he said. I agreed, but I wasn't playing defense anymore. I dug deeper, contacting the county records office to review any recent complaints filed from within our community. And there they were, 5 separate submissions, all targeting different neighbors, all worded with the same overly formal tone and all originating from the same IP address. I handed the evidence to the sheriff, who had become more like an old friend by now, and he opened an official investigation into harassment through misuse of public systems. That lit a match. Soon after, I got a knock on my door from a man in his 50s who introduced himself as Glenn. Said he was Karen's brother-in-law, had seen the viral video, and come into town to check on family. But something about the way he looked at me made it clear he wasn't here for pleasantries.
He asked if I had any intention of suing Karen or destroying her reputation.
I told him her reputation was something she had cultivated and managed all on her own like a poisonous shrub. He didn't smile, but he nodded, then quietly admitted that the house Karen lived in wasn't even in her name. It belonged to her sister, his wife, who'd been paying the property tax while Karen played queen of the cul-de-sac. Apparently, Karen had promised to keep things orderly and peaceful in exchange for free housing. That agreement clearly had expired. Glenn handed me a manila envelope with the deed and a statement confirming that Karen had no legal authority to represent the property or the HO. He said, "Just thought you should know," and walked off without waiting for a thank you.
I didn't waste time.
I brought the documentation to the next board meeting where we discussed a motion to formally review Karen's eligibility to serve in any HOA capacity, past or present.
The result was unanimous.
A special resolution was passed stating that anyone not legally named on a property deed would no longer be eligible for board leadership, effective immediately and retroactively. It was surgical, professional, and impossible to fight. The final blow came when Karen herself tried to show up at the next HOA open house event, a community barbecue we'd planned to celebrate the new direction of the neighborhood. She wore oversized sunglasses, a sun hat, and a flowy cardigan like she was incognito at Coachella. She hovered near the edge of the crowd, trying to speak to people one by one, spinning a tale of victimhood, betrayal, and conspiracies, but no one took the bait. They offered polite nods, stepped away mid-sentence, or handed her paper plates, and suggested she try the ribs. Someone handed her a lemonade and said it was unsweetened, just how she liked it, with a smirk that said everything else. Eventually, she made her way to me, standing by the grill with an apron that read, "Smoke them if you got them." She said nothing for a long time, just stood there, staring at the smoke curling up from the coals, eyes watering slightly from either heat or humiliation. I offered her a burger. She declined. I said, "You know, Karen, you could have just been a good neighbor." That's all anyone ever wanted. She opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again, looked down at her shoes, and turned away. She didn't walk off angrily. She didn't make a scene. She just faded like an echo of something that used to be loud, but wasn't anymore. As the sun dipped behind the trees, laughter rose from the gathering like music. The HOA was no longer a battleground. It was a backyard, a place where people shared food, stories, and lawn chairs. The gate was open, not just physically, but metaphorically. And for the first time since I moved in, I felt like I wasn't just surviving this neighborhood. I was part of it. Karen had tried everything. She'd locked gates, filed bogus reports, staged whisper campaigns, and twisted every rule she could find. But none of it worked. Not because I fought harder, but because I fought smarter. Because I never stooped to her level, even when it would have been easy. And because the truth, when handled with patience and precision, has a way of doing what rage never could. Winning. It was a Sunday morning when the HLA board, now running smoother than a well-oiled garage door, voted unanimously to elect a new president. And somehow all eyes turned to me. I had come in that day expecting to finalize next quarter's maintenance budget and approve Mara's proposal for a butterfly garden, but instead I found myself nominated, seconded, and voted in before I even finished my coffee. There was no campaign, no speech, no victory music, just a quiet acknowledgement that I had earned the trust of people who once hid behind closed blinds when Karen walked down the street with her clipboard of doom. I didn't celebrate, not outwardly. I walked home under a sky that seemed just a little bluer and nodded politely at every neighbor who waved, smiled, or gave me a thumbs up. The neighborhood had transformed, and not just in terms of policy or leadership. People were planting flowers they actually liked, not just ones that matched HOA guidelines. Kids rode scooters without fear of being reported for sidewalk disruption. Porch lights twinkled in the evenings, not from fear, but from actual hospitality. And somewhere in all that, the spirit of the community had shifted from silent compliance to quiet joy. I hosted a final cookout on the community green, not as a statement, but as a symbol. No fences, no RSVP lists, no clipboard at the gate. Just good food, open air, and a sense of shared ownership. I brought my grill. Mara brought cupcakes. Pete handled the lighting. And 3 teenagers brought their speakers and blasted classic funk until the sun dipped behind the rooftops and lit the sky in gold. People danced barefoot on the grass. Even the HOA treasurer who'd once voted to fine someone for hanging towels on their balcony. There was laughter, real and contagious. I stood near the food table, apron on, tongs in hand, flipping burgers while neighbors came up one by one to say things they'd been meaning to say for months. Thank you. I didn't think she'd ever lose. I almost moved out. You reminded us we're not powerless. Each comment hit me with a strange kind of weight, not heavy, but meaningful. And then, just when I thought the final act had ended, Karen reappeared. She walked up the path from the far end of the lawn, wearing beige slacks and a floral blouse that looked like it had been ironed with a grudge. She didn't flinch under the dozens of eyes that turned to follow her, but she didn't smile either. She moved carefully, a ghost haunting the very kingdom she once ruled. She approached me at the grill like nothing had happened, like we were just two neighbors at a summer party. I looked at her, waiting. She looked at the burgers. Then, in the most anticlimactic moment possible, she asked if there were any vegetarian options. I told her there were veggie patties in the cooler. She nodded once and walked away to grab a plate. No fuss, no drama, just oddly quiet acceptance. For a few moments, everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something. An outburst, a scene, a final declaration of war, but it never came. Karen found a spot on a bench near the garden, ate in silence, then stood, handed her plate to a kid with a trash bag, and walked back down the path and out of view. No one clapped, no one booed, no one followed. She just faded, the last act in a play that no longer had room for her role. That night, as the crowd thinned and chairs were folded away, I stayed behind to clean up. The string lights hummed softly above me, and the air was filled with the smell of charcoal and citronella. Pete joined me to stack tables, and Mara handed me a tin of leftover brownies. I stood there for a long while afterward, alone, looking at the place that had once felt like enemy territory, now glowing like a page rewritten with better words. The transformation hadn't happened because of brute force or louder argument. It had happened because truth, when documented and calmly wielded, becomes a scalpel instead of a hammer. Karen had underestimated how much power there is in just showing up, staying steady, and refusing to be baited. She expected shouting, retaliation, chaos. What she got instead was a wall of quiet resistance, too patient to fail and too well-domined to fight. A week later, I received a formal letter from the county clerk's office confirming that all complaints tied to the anonymous filings had been traced back to Karen's address. While no criminal charges would be filed, she would be barred from filing further zoning complaints for 2 years unless accompanied by legal verification. It was poetic in a bureaucratic sort of way. And just when I thought the universe had run out of poetic twists, I got a notice in my mailbox from the HOA's legal consultant. Due to new bylaw reforms passed under the updated board, any vehicle found parked regularly on another resident's property without permission would be subject to automatic towing after 24 hours. Alongside the notice was a photo of Karen's old car, still parked where my fence had once trapped it in, now neglected and sun-faded, slowly being swallowed by weeds. It was like the final punctuation mark in a very strange, very satisfying sentence. I waited exactly 24 hours. I filed the towing report and at noon the next day, the truck came. Neighbors watched some sipping iced tea like they were at a sporting event. The tow operator, unaware of the saga, joked that the car looked like it had been cursed. When the chain clinked and the car rose, it felt like the last remnant of a shadow lifting off the land. Afterward, I walked back to my porch, sat in my chair, and closed my eyes. Peace, I realized, isn't always quiet. Sometimes it's a hum beneath laughter, a breeze through new flowers, a kid's scooter scraping happily across pavement. Sometimes it's just the absence of fear. Karen had tried to make this place hers through power, but in the end, all she did was reveal how strong the community could become without her. The HOA gate still stands, still opens and closes like it always did. But now it doesn't guard Karen's rules. It welcomes balance, reason, and a little bit of neighborly mischief. And every time I drive through it, I remember the day she slammed it shut in my face, certain she just won. Funny thing about gates, they keep people out, sure, but they also keep people in. And the moment she locked me out, she built the wall that would ultimately close around her. Not with anger, not with vengeance, just with truth, patience, and one very well placed fence.